seminal member of what used to be called the Los Angeles School, or the Southern California School, which includes Frank Gehry, Tom Main, Craig Hodges, Ming Fong, a few others. It's a really interesting group, as characterized by their certain commonalities, as they are by their really interesting differences. I think the regional questions of Los Angeles or West Coast or East Coast are less important to them because they all have established practices, international practices. But the issues that I think that they raise continue to capture our imagination and drive the discourse of architecture. So for that reason alone, it's great to have Eric here. But even more importantly, I can't remember how many he did, Rob. This is our 12th Baumer or something like that? It's like a long. I mean, yeah, so we have a whole lot of, we have these guys come in and they spend 3 or 4 days with the 6-year students, and there's an in-depth study of their work, and then the guest comes in, spends 7 to 10 hours with them, and basically it's the kind of exposure to a personality and to a practice and to an intellectual approach to architecture. It just seems impossible to get otherwise, and it's really been fantastic. And I have to say, each of the Baumers have been great. Each of them has approached the problem differently. Tom Main came in and did 1,000 slides from the very first day. I mean, literally slides, so that tells you how long ago it was. From the very first day he was born to the very last step he took. Peter Eisman just came in and did what he always does, just talk and stuff like that. But what's interesting about Eric is, and I'm saying this because I think this is an important way to introduce the lecture. I've seen Eric lecture many times, and I thought myself to be familiar with his work. I count his work among the most difficult to penetrate, difficult to grasp. Its motives, its methods, and its opportunities. And what I've discovered from the Baumer, because I've sat in on most of the sessions, and certainly all the analysis sessions that I was in, it's impossible to get any idea of his work from a lecture. He will show you a few things. I suspect he'll show you the helmet. Are you going to show the helmet by Henry Moore?
Maybe.
Okay, so there's a good chance he'll show you this one image, and you'll see it, and you'll see its relationship to his work, and you think, okay, I kind of get it. You don't get it. You're never going to get it from a lecture. And you're never going to get it, actually, until you do the kind of study that we did. And it really has changed my relationship to the work profoundly. I've gone from being a fan to, I think, I wouldn't say an acolyte, but I really do like it now. So let me introduce to you our lecture, which what will be a very entertaining and enlightening evening, but will leave you no more enlightened about his work than you before you came in. And so I will encourage you to meet with any of the Baumer students to get a full 8 to 10 hour introduction.
Thanks, Jeff. Pleasure to be here, and is it Baumer? And to occupy the Baumer chair, or are you occupying the chair? Well, whoever is occupying the chair, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I don't think it's ever been my intention, and I don't want to start this off with a debate with Jeff, to be illegible or enigmatic or inscrutable. And those are just probably synonyms for something like what Jeff said. So you're going to have to tell me when we get to the end of the discussion whether in fact you know a little bit more or know a little bit less, and we can talk about that for a moment or two, probably not 8 hours. So, war, famine, pestilence, death, and architecture. Not the typical chronology. Architecture does have, or should have, I think, a prognostication or a revelatory aspect to it. This is a woodcut, well-known woodcut, I think early in the 15th century by Dürer, who was both a remarkable artisan, but also traded on or exploited or capitalized on what is a shared story or message. And I think part of this discussion has to do with the fact that what we've got around us now as architects, reasonably well known, who cruise in and out of this hall, among other places, are more artisans, but less those who are capable of telling a story or a narrative, and certainly never a collective or shared story. And one of the reasons Kipnis can stand up here and say it's difficult to understand is that the stories now, if they are stories that surround the work of a particular architect, are almost inevitably idiosyncratic, private, personal, because there is no generic narrative to which to appeal, different than Dürer, who was referencing a story in the Christian Bible about what was coming next that his audience shared. So the artisanship in combination with the narrative gave it a meaning. Artisanship absent a narrative, or artisanship with a private narrative, makes access a little bit more difficult. So maybe this is what Jeff was trying to say, that it's difficult to get access to a private narrative when there is, in fact, no shared or relatively little shared current common narrative. Meanwhile, in Paris in May of 1915, in a little theater on the Champs-Élysées, Mr. Stravinsky, with some assistance from Nijinsky and Diaghilev, you may know of this event, produced a 33-minute piece called The Rites of Spring. And there are many stories about this. What happened? There was a riot. The riot was instigated by the progenitors. The riot came out of the audience. There was a riot. There wasn't a riot. Maybe there was a riot. Maybe the riot wasn't a riot. But whatever it was, there was a stir. And I think the discourse is important, not only to music, but to us, because the fundamental question, I think, that was being asked was, what's music? So the atonality, the dissonance, the making of music which sounded foreign to a conventional or even an unconventional audience, not anticipated. What is music is probably also a question that we could apply to architecture. And I think in general, I said this to the group yesterday, I think the premise of what we're doing or what we aspire to do is to acknowledge that there's more to know. There's more remaining to be learned, whether it's music or architecture or almost anything else. More remains to be learned than we know or can know. There's another point of view which is antithetical to that, which is essentially we know almost everything we need to know, and what remains to do is simply to fill in the details. So I think at least a piece of the premise of this is more remains to be learned than we can know. And in a sense, and you've heard this before, the purpose of the work, or if there are insights in the work, it's to uncover or discover or to raise questions or problems or issues, and not to state, except provisionally, meaning momentarily, that certain questions have been resolved. This is a column at the base of the cistern, the Roman cistern in Istanbul, across from Hagia Sophia, before there was a Hagia Sophia. And I raise it because I think it makes an essential point about the way architecture moves from culture to culture. There are currently a lot of discussions about architecture as friendly architecture, as congenial architecture, as supportive from one generation to another. I think the way architecture moves historically, at least in certain situations, is by rejecting what preceded it and proposing something which is antithetical to that. It has to do with history and the drag of the past on the future and what the obligations of the present might be facing a powerful history. So the Greeks built a temple near this site, built a temple and Medusa, and that celebrated the Medusa. You remember the Medusa with the snakes on the head and so on. You know what happens if you look, and you turn to stone. So the Greeks at a small scale built a temple. The Romans disassembled the temple, took the pieces and brought it to the site, and used the pieces to make columns and supports in order to hold the lid, which was at grade level, for the cistern. The water percolated down and fell to the floor. So from the Greek religiosity to the Roman utility, from the Greek temple to the Roman cistern. And what the Romans did was to take the column capital, in two cases, the Medusa, and flipped it upside down. They took the column capital, inverted it, flipped it upside down, and stuck it underwater. So I didn't read this anywhere, nobody told me this, but my sense is that this is a Roman attack on the antecedent or the pedigree of the Greeks. The Greeks have Phidias. The Greeks have Aeschylus. The Greeks have a kind of esoteric literary and cultural and artistic history. And the Romans are something else. The Romans are momentum and energy and force and size. But possibly the Greek pedigree is troublesome or bothersome. It's something they don't do. It's something they don't have. So they make an attempt to eradicate it, which they don't quite do. Because, of course, the recollection of the Medusa still remains, albeit underwater. This is a piece that Jeff mentioned, and I think I can use it as a model, as a conceptual model, or as a generic model for a lot of the work that we do. It doesn't mean literal, but it has to do with the interrelationship of parts going from outside to inside. So this is the helmet. It's a sculpture called The Helmet by Henry Moore. You may know it. The sculpture is something like this size. They're small. There are a series of them. But it's not the helmet you recognize, I guess, in the building next door, which is congruent, fits your head, or Achilles' helmet. Eyes are eyes, ears are ears, nose is nose. So the helmet the helmet recalls the head underneath. In this case, there are two very different figures. So there's an exterior and there's an interior, and there's a zone of difference in between. And simply what we did is to label the outside of the helmet, the outside of the outside, the inside surface of the helmet, the inside of the outside. And as we move through these zones, the meanings change. Outside of the outside, inside of the outside, and then there's a space. And we call that space the glue, which associates the inside of the outside with the outside of the inside. So it's the outside of the outside, the inside of the outside, the glue, the outside of the inside of the inside. And each one of those pieces obligates one another. They're different, they have different meanings, and in the aggregate, we have conceptually an architectural model. This is a quick 2 minutes, since you've spent the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 years studying the history of architecture. So I'm going to save you a lot of time, and I'm going to do it for you in a couple of minutes and tell you a little bit about how it was done and what it might mean. I think the premise is that architecture is not, as it makes its own argument, itself, but rather it associates or attempts to associate with cultural, with intellectual, with artistic pedigrees already proven and says, this is us, this is what we do. It makes those associations in a number of fields. For instance, so now we're in 1900, this is Juan Gris on your left, and 25 years later in Algiers, Le Corbusier, and architecture is Cubism. And then about into the 20s, the Ford assembly line, beginning to make automobiles, produce automobiles in an assembly line. And on the right, the Bauhaus. Architecture is machine, architecture is technique. So from a Ford assembly line, extrapolate architecture, architecture to machine. In the 1960s, physiology and experimental work in the science of the human body, metabolism, so architecture becomes metabolism. That's Kenzo Tange in Tokyo Bay on the right. A little bit later along, early 1970s, mid-1970s, Paul de Man, who has an interesting history as a literary critic, began as a writer in Western Europe when Hitler came through Western Europe, went to Harvard, dumped his wife and his kid, did a number of unfriendly things, wound up at Yale as a literary critic. The only reason I mention that is that those who have discoursed on deconstruction have on occasion tried to explain it as de Man's way of deconstructing his own life. That is to say, of getting rid of it. And what is deconstruction? What is literary deconstruction? It's a literary movement. What is it? You know the novel Moby Dick. You've read the novel Moby Dick. There is a novel Moby Dick. Herman Melville wrote the novel Moby Dick. No, there is no single Moby Dick. There are just Mobys and Dicks, and it depends on you and you and you and you in order to tell us your version of what Moby Dick might be. So there's no singular Moby Dick. And this is Peter Eisenman's project down the street, which has been labeled deconstruction. And then the last one is the matrix in digital coding. And next to it on the right is a young architect at UCLA whose work is of some interest called Jason Payne, so that architecture has become digital coding. So you can see over the last 100 years that architecture is art, architecture is cubism, architecture is technique, architecture is engineering, architecture is human physiology, architecture is metabolism, architecture is literary criticism, deconstruction, architecture is literary coding. Or is it? This image was shot in Alamogordo, New Mexico. At the time, the American team was in the process of inventing the atomic bomb. And I think for many of you, for many of us, the issue of applied science and the role of applied science, whether it's holes in the wall or hanging lights or ducts, the artifacts of the crankshaft image, applied science has been very germane to the image of radical architecture. Want to be a radical architect? Punch a few holes and hang down a few ducts. And the question that this picture raises, and I mentioned this in the seminar the other day, is to what purpose? What is applied science sitting on? What does it mean? Because these guys who gathered in the desert to make an atomic bomb could have gathered in the desert to invent a power plant or a ship or a house, travel to the moon, make a train. They could have done any number of things. So we shouldn't confuse the intellectual capacity, the applied intellectual capacity addressed in the sciences, to ipso facto of virtue because of what it does. It's science sitting on something else, just like architecture always sits on something else. The question is, what premise is it sitting on? And in this case, the premise was make a bomb for such and such reasons. The premise could have been different. So that makes applied science more of a neutral condition rather than ipso facto a virtue. Meanwhile, in art history, Mondrian appears on the screen. Straight lines, black, white, gray, red, blue, yellow. Really an ideology of what sometimes we hear referred to as minimalism. And minimalism as an essence, meaning if you scrape away all the fluff, if you scrape away almost everything, you get the essence, which is almost nothing. And here it is. Or is it? Meanwhile, on the right side of the painting, this is actually the painting on the right side. So the lines are, in fact, made of tape, and the tape falls off. The painted surfaces are not homogeneous surfaces, not smooth surfaces. The colors are not consistent colors, and of course, at all ages. So could it be that almost nothing is simultaneously almost everything? This is the Lyon Ballet. Saw this a couple years ago, and I have to say the images fascinated me. You know the line, I assume it bounces around here too. What you see is what you get. So I guess the premise of this is what you see is not what you get, and what you get is what you for sure don't see. What the dancers did, or the directors, they wrapped the dancers with huge pads. So you're looking, usually, you go to a dance performance, you're looking at dancers, and you see very athletic and dexterous people cruising around the stage. And you recognize or you anticipate their capacity as a function of what appears to be their physiology. So the intention here was to reverse the appearance, but not to reverse the result. So you had these padded up characters, Michelin men and women, with all of this stuff prancing around the stage, doing the remarkable kinds of things that the Lyon Ballet does. And in case you didn't get it, in the end they stripped off all the pads and you could see this sort of macho Camacho stuff. But again, don't count on what you see being what you see. This is an early project, well, maybe not so early. It goes back about 15 years. And I wanted to start with this in terms of the juxtaposition of almost nothing and almost everything. It's a small project for an office building. And we often discuss, and we're often asked how we make projects and what tools we use. And we try not to be subscribers to any particular tool. And in fact, as the number of tools have grown, the process in the office seems to have attenuated and gotten longer. We don't seem to be able to get rid of anything, but we add a lot of pieces. The model was made with a lemon rind, actually. So the surface, this is actually a piece of a lemon, which pushes out of the surface of the wall and probably belongs in a certain sense to a project that was proposed about 10 years earlier, which was a house on a hillside. And that house, whose surfaces were curvilinear, at the next step were then understood to be blocks which were orthogonal pieces. So this raises something of a question of what constitutes a curve, or is a curve, or is a curve a straight line, or is it possible to juxtapose a generic geometry with increments, assuming something big is always made out of pieces that are small, so that what you're doing with a curve is actually asymptotic to the curve, but using pieces not typically understood as intended to make curves. Ergo, this project was made out of 1,000 blocks, 8 by 8 by 8 concrete blocks, which typically you fill with cement and reinforcing steel. And every block was the same, and every block was different. Now, this is in the era that just precedes the advent of the computer in the office. And I think, and maybe we'll get to this in a little more detail, a distinction between those two eras is probably worthwhile to discuss, because the building itself is a little bit clumsy and a little bit crude and a little bit awkward. And we couldn't quite draw it. We could approach it. We actually made plywood forms both on the inside and the outside in order to implement it. So what we're doing is learning how to draw it, and in the process learning how to build it. And maybe when we get to the end, we have it figured out. It has to do with joint size, edge to edge, and a whole series of technical issues. Advent of the Rhino menu, for instance, which makes the discussion very different, because a menu of this kind anticipates or makes an effort to anticipate, you know, you can do this one and this one and this one and this one, and you can do all of these things. So the catalog of possibilities is now available to you now, but not 15 years ago in a menu. So it makes the delivery of the result a simpler kind of problem. It's different. So it's different to make something when you're not sure how to draw it and not positive how to build it. And there's a risk in that, in the sense that it may work and it may not. Whereas the advent of the new software might allow you to build the very same thing. But the meaning of the very same thing, whatever it looks like, I think is substantially different. It might be the image of something you don't quite know, but the tool is something we know very well, and I think the tool allows us to anticipate and to warranty what the lack of the tool didn't allow us to anticipate and to warranty. And this is really the other side. I mentioned almost in that Mondrian comment, almost nothing and almost everything. And this is something that we call the box, or unboxing the box, a little bit facetiously, because it's enough of a box to be known as a box and not enough of a box to be, in fact, clearly the box. And I think the box is a topic in the discourse on architecture in the last 100 years has first been a kind of ideal image, maybe in terms of the austerity quotient of Mondrian, and maybe in the recent years a kind of a pariah. Don't make the box or unbox the box. The box is too easy, the box is too simple, the box is too predictable. So in that period of time, making Trevita and making the box, and in a sense covering all the conceptual possibilities between almost everything and almost nothing, in a theoretical sense, in those two projects. This is a project that was done initially for the Los Angeles Philharmonic at about the time that it looked like the Disney Hall wouldn't be built. It was done for a group that produces something called the Green Umbrella Series, which is an experimental music series which is run in Los Angeles for a number of years and had no venue and needed one. And part of the operational problem was to produce a flexible interior. And the other part was to produce a kind of bandbox on the exterior for about 20 to 25 musicians from the LA Phil who would sit outside and perform. And you can start to see how the project was studied and made. There's a discourse with trusses, with a new truss which is made out of steel, an old truss amended that belonged to an original roof, an existing truss which is exposed, and then this bent glass canopy. And I think this is the first time that overhead bent glass had ever been done. And I told the story. You can see what we did here. It wasn't a certainty that we could make the glass, that we could engineer it and fabricate it. And we were told by those who always know, don't do it, you can't draw it, you can't bid it, you can't build it, can't fabricate it, it'll break, it'll leak, and they'll sue you. And all of that happened. Nevertheless, as your parents have always advocated perseverance, when it's 4th and 10 or something, we did that. And you can see here, we were trying to understand a form or a form language that it would allow us to fabricate this stuff. We finally did find a fabricator near Los Angeles with some engineers in Paris and some others in Switzerland, and we were able to build it. I think what's interesting to me is that people selling this glass now from Shenzhen and Guangzhou, from Kaikursa in Barcelona, and other places can make this available to you. So, hey kid, you want to do this, you want to bend it, we can bend it, you want to twist it, we can twist it, no problem. It's not quite no problem, but the evolution of that discussion in a very short time, I think, means something interesting. Again, it means that the time it was done and the result that was achieved, for better or worse, lawsuits, cracking, but it's up, is different than if we were to build it now under conditions for engineering and fabrication that have evolved substantially from that period of time. Meanwhile, in the early 2000s, we were invited to a couple of competitions. I'll show one in St. Petersburg in Russia for the Kirov ballet, directed by quite a remarkable character called Valery Gergiev, who I continue to know and love, although his political acumen is not coincident with his musical acumen. But on the left is what they call the Mariinsky Theater. For those of you who know, St. Petersburg was built in the middle of the 19th century, and it looks like that. This was the original proposal, sketch for the project. And then we went through a series of steps working with Valery, among others, using a term that you'll know and recognize, a module. So like the Trevita project with a block module. So these are also modules. We called the modules the pillows. But the pillows are modules at a very different scale. They're at this scale. And they deal with sight lines, and they deal with structure, and they deal with access, and they deal with acoustics. So that when you want to move it, you push it and bend it and stretch it. You do all of that. So it's a malleable module, and we began to develop the project on that basis. This was an early study, and then a later study. The interior of this theater was asymmetrical, and then a clay. And you can see the tools. I mean, some are clay, some are handmade, some are printed, some are milled, all of that. And this is a series of setting and dealing with the glass. The press in Russia, we did two projects. One was called the Iceberg, one was called the Ice Cube, this being the iceberg. And the role of glass in this became a big topic and a controversial topic, particularly acoustically. And at the time we were working with the Arab people in London. But this starts to deal with, this won't go anywhere near explaining it, but this deals with acoustics, and this deals with seating, and this deals with the envelope, and this deals with putting all the pieces together. So this was the solution that won the competition originally. Then a number the best thing to do, I think, as a lesson to you is until it starts to go up, you just keep it quiet. And we were asked to exhibit it in the Russian Pavilion in the Venice Biennale, and really a lot of hell and controversy broke loose. And the ultimate result of that was the rerunning of the competition, which is this one, as you see here, which is modified to some extent. But the premise, we did raise, I think I mentioned this to Jeff, to the jury that an analysis, and whether this is facetious or facetiously unfacetious, but the 19th century Russian neoclassical building, which belongs to France really, and divides elevations of buildings in very conventional and predictable ways. And we went in and presented a kind of hypothesis which says, this is why this building is analogous, appropriate, fits into the center of the city of St. Petersburg. And after the jury, Prix came up, he was on the jury, came up to me and he said, boy, that was a great speech. It sounded really great, sounded good, sounded convincing. And then I looked at the image and the argument went away. So, as it probably should have. This is the section, but what we were trying to do is bridge the gap between what clearly was not part of a tradition in a conventional sense, not to say constructivism and all of those issues, but a tradition of architecture in St. Petersburg. Anyway, this is a section, and you can see as the glass condition starts to leak into the interior of the theater. And this is interesting, actually, and I'm not going to slow it down for you, but when we presented this model was actually made by the Europe guys in London. And you can start it and stop it, and it purports to show the results or the consequences of the glass, which is a hard surface, on the interior vis-a-vis the wood and the cloth of the seats and all of that. In other words, making a case that the interior of the building was operationally intelligent. So this was the second solution. That's a little piece of history there that we had to hold on to the Sierra Club in St. Petersburg. This is a competition that we won in the early 2000s for the Queens Museum of Art. You may know the site, which very much belongs to Robert Moses. There were two World's Fairs there, one in the 1930s, one in the 1960s. Grand Central Parkway, Van Wyck, and this is called the New York City Building, which was to become a museum. And one of the, this is a lesson or an admonition to all of you that the teaching and the learning of the history of architecture is useful in any number of cases, including this one. So this is a project outside the yard at Harvard called the Carpenter Center, done by Le Corbusier. 2 streets, Prescott Street, Quincy Street, and a ramp which pulls you through the project. And what was interesting about the ramp, it's always been of use in a public policy sense, because I think the general argument is that most buildings on most streets in most cities, or most buildings on most campuses, belong solely to the people who go there for class, for exhibitions, and so on, and don't belong to anyone else. Ergo, whatever special experience or knowledge or value there is in those buildings, which ought rightly perhaps to belong to a broader audience, doesn't. It belongs to a limited audience. So what he did was what the architect did was to run the ramp through, and while you're on the way from English to physics, and you take the shortcut, and you see art, and you see sculpture, and you see graphics, and all of that, which you can either pass by or take another look, and so on. So it avails itself of a different audience, a different constituency, and it's an unusual way of integrating a private process with a public purpose. You don't see that so often. Then Jim Sterling in the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, you live up here, and you take the bus down here, and you walk through the museum and down the ramp, get on the bus, and on the way to the bus, you get a taste of the local culture or the international culture. You participate in the world of art. So that strategy then was applied to the Queen's Museum. In this case, there's a little zoo here. So we call this art on the way to the zoo. So if you happen to be at the zoo, it's not a colossal, it's not like the Bronx Zoo, it's a little zoo. But the point was the point, and the point was more essential than really the scale or the specifics, so that you had people on the way to and from other events who would go through the museum and presumably benefit from the museum's content. I noticed when I was going through this an hour or so ago that we have now a pretty consistent habit of presenting work as a chronology, as a sequence. I think it's a little bit disingenuous, but from a client point of view or from an audience point of view, it presents the project logically and consistently as a series of steps, as a sequence. And you see that here. So this is the existing building, and then it was opened up, and then a piece was inserted. You can see that here, existing building, opened up, acoustic mountain, and so on. So that it looks, if you accept the first step, then the second step follows logically, and so on and so on. And then the excavated events belong to what was integral to the museum and the on-grade areas where the public was allowed to go through. This is a project a few years following that, Mexico City Library, National Library, that we were invited to do. We didn't win this one. We came second. And this is a train station to give you the scale. This is in northwest center of Mexico City. About 300,000 people come in and out of this train station from the suburbs to the city every day. So we're going to now hold on to the train station, which was used, by the way, in an analogous fashion as the zoo was used to the Queen's Museum to bring people through the library. I have to say, by the way, that when you have an opportunity, and you'll see when it comes to you, when you have an opportunity to do a project like the Kirov or the Mariinsky, or a project like the National Library in Mexico City, it really elevates the discourse on architecture to a different level. Because I think what you have an opportunity to do is touch the culture and move the culture in a very particular way, to do something that the ordinary building can't do. In this case, we had a consultant who is the librarian at Stanford University. And I remember him saying to me that it did something called the Green Library, which is about as sophisticated a library in a technical sense as you can possibly find. And I remember him saying to me, the students who come to Stanford, 99.99, come with laptops. The people who will come to this library in Mexico City, it's 0.9 that have the laptops. So what this project allows the architect, the city, and the culture to do is to make available to this local citizenry, to the citizens of Mexico City, a whole body of new information, a whole group of new tools, and an entirely different way to access, work with, and understand the world. That's a very special opportunity for an architect. And as I said, I think it really elevates its meaning. Again, series of diagrams. I won't go through all, but a primary street, connections to the surrounding block, what we called the acoustic mountain, which was a buffer against the train noise, breaking this up in terms of programmatic pieces, a series of courts, and then rolling back this building at the entry and making a public plaza or space that conjoins both the library and the train station together. And this was a study model. This was the first stage, and then I think they knock it down to about 5 or 6 people. This is Teotihuacan. Do you know this at all? Anybody know this? Is about an hour outside of Mexico City. It's a bit of a mystery, actually. It's very, very old. This may be back to the discussion of what we don't know as opposed to what we do. But it's very, very old. Nobody knows exactly who did it. But one of the discussions that comes up in this internationalism or internationalization of architecture is that international architecture is an architect who lives in Paris, flying to Guangzhou or Almaty and building the same thing he builds in Paris. So the question about internationalism is there a voice? Is it possible to introduce what belongs locally or regionally to a discourse which wouldn't be homogenized from place to place? I had a funny discussion the other day. I give a talk in a place called Abu Dhabi, which is part of the Emirates. And the guy who was the head planner there at the end of the talk stood up and he said something like, "Mr. Moss, can you tell us how we can I mean, this is Abu Dhabi, where you either got sand, high-rises, zippity-doo-dah buildings, and everything else. So it may be a little bit late for the discussion, better never than late, or better late than never. But he's saying very earnestly, how can we introduce the local cultural voice in this discourse? So there is somewhere in all of this, I don't come here to tell you I know the answer to this, but in some ways, northern China is different than southern China, and Western Europe different than Eastern, and Spain a little bit different than San Francisco, and so on. The question is, are there areas that belong to the history of these cultures, either looking backward or going forward, that would allow any sort of localized or regionalized discourse that might give an insight into architecture done in one place that wouldn't belong in another place? Or is it all to be homogenized? So this is an open question. But when we were talking about this, we were taking a look. So the idea wouldn't be to replicate Teotihuacan or any of that. These are a series of courtyards here, which are different. They belong to the seasons. They belong to uses and they belong to the seasons, so that the form of the courtyard, the shape of the courtyard, the size of the courtyard has to do with the movement of the sun. So typically buildings are handled in order to prevent the sun or to prevent heat. So this is a little bit different. More sun, less sun, but different conditions so that the courtyards reflect use and purpose as they do reflect the seasons. And this seemed to us to be something like some of the content that you found along with that enormous walk at Teotihuacan. Anyway, these are the model studies, and then there's a big information visitor and of course the requisite media center at the front of the project. This is the final model. And then this competition we also won. This was 06, 07. The Smithsonian Institute next to the MCI Center in Washington, D.C. The building is a 19th century building. It was originally called the Patent Office Building, which means that models and drawings of, I don't know who, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, people like that would be recorded there, memorialized there. So you want to see what Alexander Graham Bell did, you go in and you see it. And when they gave us the brief for the project, they said, okay, this used to be the Patent Office Building. Please make us a building in the tradition of invention and discovery as the history of the inventions in this building documents. So I think we did that. I'm not sure they were comfortable with the solution. So this has a different antecedent. This is from a painter you might know called Seurat, and French painter, a 19th century painter. And one of the interesting aspects of his work is that if you study the paintings, I think the content in a social way, in a sociological way, is extremely conservative. So you know the one on the banks of the Seine, and everybody's sitting in the right place, the right dog's on the right leash, everybody wears the right clothes, all of that kind of stuff, except it's done with this stuff, you know, with the dots. So technique is different than social content. So the social content conservative, the technique very different. So what I did, or what I argued, was extrapolating from this series of points to another condition here, which is a kind of roof structure, because the assignment for the project, what they asked the competitors to do, this is during the Bush administration, is to make what they called democracy's room in Washington, D.C., because there was no sign of democracy's room in Washington, D.C., meaning put a lid over that space, and then we'd have democracy's room, presumably. Yes, this is what they said. So this is a topographical diagram, not a topological diagram, of what is a combination or a reconciliation of this venue and this venue. They wanted two demountable presentation and seating venues, and the mapping of the acoustics put together, don't forget this is not Carnegie Hall, but the mapping of the acoustics put together gave you this profile, which turned out to be the profile of the ceiling, because the pipes are used. The pipes are 1 meter in diameter and somewhere between 6 to 12 meters in length, roughly speaking. And they're laminated glass, there's 2 pieces of laminated glass. We know absolutely how to do this, although they at the time were not convinced. There are supports on either side of the space. Here you see the Varandales, and then there's a cable and a tube, and the glass tubes are compression members that function structurally, as compression members in the truss spanning between the Varandales, and then supporting what essentially is a glass lid over the top of all of that. And this little diagram just showing the tube, and then the collar, and then another collar, and the cable. Now, the compression member doesn't end at the cable, so the length had to do not only with a structural issue, but with an acoustic issue. Now, a whole series of ancillary pieces that had to do with lights and plugs and cameras and all of that. But essentially, this was both acoustic and structural, supporting the roof. This is a model I think we made later for the Biennale, but you can see Seurat in the background, and then this is the exterior and the interior with the glass tubes. And by the way, our colleague and friend and client in Culver City saw that presentation, and we're now making a smaller version for him at a different scale, which surrounds a small courtyard. It's really commercial space in Los Angeles. So here we are in Guangzhou, a city. I mean, the whole conception of building buildings and building high buildings, or the conception of buildings as singly important, as a consequence of the fact that one building is different than another and might mean something different than another. I think you could argue a lot of that is lost as building upon buildings by the hundreds come flying down to the Yellow River here, which connects to the Pacific Ocean. So this is the city growing toward the river. And then we proposed, wait a minute. So this is the wait a minute theory of urbanism, that let's sit on the commercialization of Guangzhou and introduce the cultural interlude of Guangzhou. And Zaha Hadid has built this opera house here, and the site for the museum was on the other side. Trying to see what I can see here. What we proposed actually is a mound, an earth mound that stretched between the two. I think you can see it better here. And the program of the museum actually was broken into 4 discrete blocks, galleries, with a lobby and entrance in between. So you can see the mound, and then we made here what we called the glass forest. We called that the long art march. And you can see that walk, the long art march, so that this again is a barrier between the commercial world and the cultural world. And the cultural world is certainly more of an introverted world. You can see the 4 gallery areas. And then you enter into this space, and then you go down it. And presumably, as you go along and as you go in, the further you go in, the more you're disassociated and dislocated from the omnipresence of the commercial world that, that surrounds you in Guangzhou. I won't go through all of these details. But essentially, there are 2 internal elements. One is that glazed condition, where natural light is plausible. And the other has to do with spaces that can't take natural light, and an intermediate zone between the two, which stores and supports both for outside that space and inside that space. I mentioned at the beginning the interest in architecture, the long-term interest in technique and assembly, and I didn't want to leave the impression that any of those prejudices that belong to that instant history of architecture are not also interests of mine. So I'm not claiming to be free of that. I'm only claiming to be cognizant of those things. It's a little bit dark. It's hard to see. But there's a ledger in here. So this is a room made out of blocks, and there's a ledger horizontally put up here diagonally, another one against the wall, and then sticks that span across that ledger, and then sticks that are attached to the sticks that span across the ledger and attached here vertically, so that what you see as a conclusion in a selective way. So the ledger is in here, the horizontal sticks are here, and the vertical sticks are here. So for a moment, in a selective way, you understand in terms of the technique how this piece was built, but selectively. And this repeats in a number of projects. A steel frame, and then which has 4 vertical tubes here, which incline at certain moments. And then to deal with the horizontal condition, a series of horizontal pipes. And then you can read that, at least by implication, on the perimeter. So tube and pipe and pipe and pipe. So at least by analogy, there's some, and then it, of course, disappears over here. And then it reappears where the building is glazed on the entry side. There's another point which I think is of some importance to me in terms of a conceptual understanding that you'll never get these buildings, that you'll never know what they mean in the way that you understand the Champs-Élysées when you take a walk or a look down. Meaning it's not a single vantage point, it's multiple vantage points and multiple ways of understanding. So whatever you do or whatever you think or whatever you know or might know, the way to the truth, to the extent that way exists in a building, is by looking at it from a number of vantage points. Ergo, what we started to do is to photograph the building from a number of different points of view. So this happens to be a lobby of an office building that we made a few years ago, but seen very differently and meaning very different things. And so that I think one could argue that understanding is both a function of what you see or what you anticipate or what you recall seeing when you were standing somewhere else. And this is that building. And then again, this was a house we did a few years ago on the west side of Los Angeles. And then this photography at the time with Polaroids by Tom Baumer, trying to reassemble that space from a number of different vantage points. And then a building that we did in Los Angeles for Cineon Kodak. Again, very different sensibilities, going down the stair, going up the stair. This was actually done in an alley in South Central Los Angeles, 2 existing buildings. And we raised the frame, a steel frame, over that road. So it's essentially an air rights project, as you can see. And then built the building in the air over that road, over the existing building. And there are 2 interludes, really, 2 courtyards. This is one of the courtyards. You're looking down on this bridge. You can see the water here. The water doesn't pile up in the pool, but comes out and then flows down a drain. This is the entrance to the building, and some of the kind of attenuated, crushed pipe as it intersects that column, and then the similarly attenuated window, and then the event space. And I think what it does, and the hypothesis for this was that every step you take is a different step in a different world. So from one end to the other and back, the building is something else and something else and something else and something else. So whatever the guy's name was who said you never step into the same river once, so there it is. This is another project which is not complete. We built as a parking structure for about 1,000 cars. And then we drew this very carefully. And until about 3 days ago, we had a lot of difficulty bidding it. The drawings are somewhat complex. And until we came to this, which we talked a little about in the seminar, so the parametric, a ruled system now for drawing. I mean, again, I'm going to have to say it would have been interlude. The wrong way. I mean, you have to tell me if the meaning of this building would be different if we had built it without digital projects, without building information modeling. We couldn't bid the project. It's not a big project, but it's inordinately expensive and it's complex. Now we can do it, so now we'll build it. So I think as I said at the beginning with respect to the Trevita discussion, you know, the 1,000 little blocks, that the meaning of what you do is not only related to its content, but its tools. To what extent do you know what's coming? to what extent can you forecast it and warranty to your constituency or your client that if you bend the glass, it'll bend and it won't break. And I think we're at a stage now where we can actually do that. So this is a little animation we made for the clients. This is the garage, which is built, and the program blocks. There are about 10 program blocks, and the blocks have to do with cafeteria and private offices, computer facilities, conference spaces, things like that. The ground level, which is the top level, is open. This is now slicing off in terms of setbacks and height limits and so on. Can you see that okay? It looks dim as hell from here. So these are the skylights facing north. Again, the lowest level, which is the top parking level, so you can see the glazing there, is essentially an open plan on that level. And these pieces, this is essentially a lounge that hangs over the entrance and welcomes you to the parking lot. Elevators. There's a bridge that ties those floor plates together on the second level. Let me keep going. You can see it next time. This is a project that we proposed in a place called Almaty, which is a city of about 2 million people. It's not the capital, or it no longer is, in Kazakhstan, which is just west of Xinjiang province in China. And to keep it simple, so this is what essentially is the program. And the program is now this euphemism, mixed use, whatever exactly that is, which has something to do with housing and something to do with office and something to do with hotel, all of that, conference space, retail, everything. And the spring, actually, I noticed you got Guy coming in here to talk. He was the engineer on this, and we started to, this is earthquake territory, seismic territory. So we were looking at the spring as a conceptual way, albeit not precedented, for dealing with a kind of elasticity in the earth. And he took one look at it and said, Moss, if you do that, when the earthquake comes, it will be in China. So we had to. I mean, we figured we dampened it down. We covered it with a cable net and so on. So we held on to that sort of conceptual, structural idea, opened the building up to a series of light wells, used the model for the president of Austria in the Biennale, in the Austrian pavilion last year. You might take a look, and this had something to do with Guy's work as well, that what was essentially a pipe structure evolved as it makes its rounds in terms of the structural condition or stress on various points of the pipe, which varies when it's more or less horizontal with respect to what it does when it's more or less vertical. This is a study, a series of study models by hand, by CNC. And then even when we solved the earthquake in this direction, we needed to solve it in this direction. So it's buttressed essentially laterally, as you can see with those are actually condo buildings. And so this was the project, which also has a very important spatial connection to what they call Republic Square, so that this space on the ground floor, which wasn't part of the brief, can be used for public events when it's too hot or too cold. Mostly it's either one or the other in Republic Square. This is another project which has, I think, a peculiar history as a piece of evolution, starting here. And then in the 90s, we added a sound studio, a production studio, to this 1930s warehouse. And then later on, added a series of offices. This is for a company called the Tennis Channel. But now we've passed the point, you can see the roof being built. So this is the Rhino drawing model, which essentially we shipped to Vancouver. Every piece is different, every stick is different, every beam is different. And it all came back very, very quickly. And the pieces were numbered, which ought to make the assembly pretty simple, assuming you can count. So of course, when they put it together, you know, 1, 2, 3, so they got a few pieces in the wrong place, but conceptually, anecdotally, it's a little bit funny. But in fact, it allows us to do now what would be extremely rare, not to say unprecedented, to make a building out of pieces where every single piece is different. And this is plausible, so this is under construction. There are actually 3 sections which have to do with a division, operational division in the Tennis Channel's office spaces. And then it was covered with this is another one of our experiments. So this is something we made in the office. It's fiberglass blown on the building. And we were trying to figure out, because it's very inexpensive, and it goes around corners and over bumps and things like that. It expands and contracts in a way that you have to be very careful of, with seams and laps and joints and so on. And ultimately, and that's the piece on the top, which is the fiberglass. I don't think that's been done. It's been done in the shop and then installed, but I don't think it's been done in place. This we talked a little bit about in Jeff's seminar, and I just touch on it briefly, what we now call Cain and Abel, which is a site in Culver City, which is on the west side of Los Angeles, with a couple of existing warehouses, a little restaurant, and about a 60-foot high tower, which used to hold an industrial press. And the proposition is really 2 identities and 2 towers which exist strategically, conceptually in opposition to one another. We remodeled these spaces, and then this is a garden and an enclosure that belongs to these people. It's actually a graphics design company that came to LA with a branch from Chicago, and you can see that interior space with the garden in the sky, which has a quality, and at least for me personally, over a distance, it's so anomalous and such a surprise. And of course, in LA, it's been identified as an advocacy for green and all of that. And I guess the cactuses are green, and if somebody wants to label it in that way, this is probably a plausible label. But I think what was in my mind was the displacement of something which typically is found in one place and is now understood as part of a vista at a completely different elevation. And we used, in a structural way, as a replica of the glass, which isn't yet built, but you can see the slices in these steel pots which hold the earth and hold the cacti. And then there's a cable that runs through there, and then the slot is less and less and less as the cable spans from side to side in the steel and supports as the bottom chord of the truss, the top chord of the truss being a steel T, and the pot being both a compression member and the load which the cable has to support. So it's both the load and the structural member in compression to support the load. So this is the idea that comes in. And then we're back to this discussion again vis-a-vis the little tower, which we also had a very difficult time bidding, and now with new tools. So when somebody gets this, when a steel fabricator, 5 steel fabricators get these drawings, and they have every piece, every size, every weight, every joint, you can't miss it, really. And because it's parametric, you make an adjustment of one piece and all the other pieces will adjust. So this, I think, will allow this to be built in the next few months. This is what's called the art tower, which was done about, I don't know, 8-10 months ago. Still not complete in terms of operation. And I think belongs to a whole series of speculations about the meaning of buildings like this. I think it owes its presence on the landscape. There it is, next to the box, and this we also talked about, to the advent of a train, which typical of Los Angeles is way late. I mean, not the train, but the train will be late too. But the construction of the train, which by the way is essentially a 19th century train. I mean, if you've been on the train from Shanghai to Beijing, it ain't this one. Nevertheless, it's a train, and it goes by this piece. So that piece as a point in the landscape, as an icon in the landscape, which identifies this area and can also produce information. So if you're sitting in Sendai or Fukushima and you got some images and you send them to the editor and up they go on these rear projected acrylic screens. There's also a little seating area there for about 150. There's a balcony here and a screen facing this way. You can have little talks. If you stretch it into the parking lot, you can talk to about 1,000 people, and these are the permission to do the project was contingent for the owner on no commercial use. So no commercial use is allowed on the project. So we're experimenting with various media. There are a number of projectors, all rear projectors. There's sound, and there's a connection to the internet. So it has the usual versatility. I think the difference is it's not just a screen on a wall like the Ginza or Times Square, but it is itself a shape and a space which has additional uses. Getting close to the end, I wanted to mention a couple of things. This is a project that we did, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, called the Dancing Bleachers, which was done at the Wexner, I think with the purpose of presenting something which is antithetical to the original architect, who seemed to make a poem to the ubiquitous grid. So this is the early grid, you know, Hippodamus and Miletus, in the first urban grid, supposedly, so that in his hands, it's the grid, and it's the folded grid, and the bent grid, and the elongated grid, and the microwave grid, the grid, the grid, the grid. And part of the argument for the grid is that it doesn't admit a center in a geometric sense. So we introduced what we call this is the analog to the Hippodamian grid, which does admit, at least hypothetically, the curve of centers. So centers against no centers. And at the time, we were asked to do a couple high-rise buildings in Los Angeles, which this was around 2000, 2001, 2002, which then sat until very recently. Comes the train, and the projects now came back. It's a little bit different now. And so we're in the process, that's a train going by, we're in the process of engineering this project. And we should be starting the construction of the garage any minute. This animation was done, I think what's unusual, a number of things unusual about the tower, but the argument in a commercial real estate sense is it's buy large spaces volumetric spaces that you would also like to have on the ground, but you get to have them in the sky. There are 3 different heights: 13.6 floor-to-floor heights, 16.6 floor-to-floor heights, 24-foot floor heights, as if those typical warehouse buildings were what you had, piled one on another. So this was the argument for the animation. And then we made an exhibition of the history of that form language, starting with the Wexner, and then going to the tower, and then going to this plasma cut installation, which finally came to rest in the Flak Tower in Austria, which is this. And this is the discussion we had, and that form language, again, with a plasma cut installation in Los Angeles. So the last group belongs, this is a project in a place called Weihai in China. And we were asked to do this. It's not a competition, but simply to do it, to make a tower, a kind of Eiffel Tower analog. Weihai is about an hour flight due west of Incheon in Korea, or South Korea. And typical of the Chinese, they're essentially remaking an entire coastline. It's a little bit unbelievable, but I guess it's not. They're making all of this kind of zippity-doo-dah, whatever you make of that. And they have a half-hour animation made by some German, which promotes the efficacy and intelligence of all of that. But anyway, there's a mound here with a tower, and so they asked us to make this tower, which has very little in the way of operational content. There's a base and a gathering area, vertical circulation and structure. There's a little bit of office space, and of course observation deck and restaurant. So it has a kind of iconic aspect, and this is the print we made. Is I have to go next week, and we see how it goes. Meanwhile, roughly the same time, we were invited to make a project, strangely enough, this is the site, with very similar contents, but much larger. And we use not a dissimilar strategy, now making the landscape, integrating the landscape with a structural system. There's a museum actually at the base, and you can see the structure that holds the museum, and an outdoor amphitheater, which was part of the Taichung program. So this is that tower in Taichung, and the interior space. And the museum is supposed to be, it's a huge space, and it's supposed to be an urban museum. Why they would need an urban museum, we could, anyway. The last project is one that we just finished, and since we started with something very small at the beginning, so this gives you an idea what we're doing at the moment. So this is in Vienna, the Danube River, the School of Arts and Architecture called the Angewandte there, and then they have an invited competition to remodel, to leave existing buildings and to remake the school. So this is a building, 7-story building that was done in 1965, as is this entry piece, 3 stories, and this first story building, this is done in 1875, and the conjunction essentially bangs one into the other. Then there's an interior courtyard. This is the beginning of a solution, but there's an interior courtyard. So this is the existing building, which borders on a canal which runs to the Danube. This is the second primary building that goes back to 1875. And this link or connection in between the two where you enter is that 3-story element. And you can see here the end of dead ends. Essentially what we argued is that we were completing the order of the building, that the building had been started and made this loop, but it didn't complete itself. And essentially what we would do is connect the primary courtyard spaces and movement pieces through the courtyard with elements in the courtyard to a circulation system on the other side. So continuity rather than discontinuity for the project. So this is, geez, I can't see it. So this has now been, for purposes of exegesis, this is taken down, but you can see courtyard, primary circulation here, and then offices and studios on the perimeter. So this is the 1875 building. This is the Ringstrasse, and then if you moved off the Ringstrasse, you would be, for those of you who know it, the MAC, the Museum of Angewandte Kunst, which is here. And part of the proposal had to do with facilitating that so you could go in here and through here, a little bit like the Queen's Museum argument, or into the MAC Museum. So we started to work on the courtyard, which heretofore had been essentially a flat site with 3 buried or partially buried structures, a walkway through here, and then a landscape which slopes. So you're in this building, walk out of that building, down the landscape, onto the roof of these buildings. It's actually, I mean, it's very intricate in a kind of IQ sense, trying to fit all these pieces together. We then added a block on the other block, attached the two with additional square footage. So again, you have the walk, you have the partially underground buildings, and this new element with an opening here which will welcome a series of connections from one side of the courtyard to the other. And these are the connections, these bridges suspended over the courtyard, glass bridges, a series of stairs, understood a little bit more like the system you have out here, or the Spanish steps where you can go to and from, where you can hang out, where you can go laterally, you can go this way, you can go laterally, you can hang around. And at very different elevations, you see back toward the center of the city as you get to the higher elevation. And then these are the pieces we call the birds on the wires. These event spaces that are gathering areas, seminar spaces, things like that, that connect or hang over the courtyard and are part of the connection or the system that runs now continuously from building to building. And then we made a partial canopy or cover glazed here, which takes its cue as a shape from the mansard roof that surrounds and covers this building, so that shape, by analogy at least, is an inheritor of the behavior, form behavior of this roof, and then it leans on that roof, partially covers the space. Meanwhile, the end in this, which is the south, open to the south and natural light, and so on and so on. And then in the front of the building, this heretofore had been essentially closed, so we proposed to refenestrate the building, open it all up, so that from the front and the entry bridge, you could see through the building and everything that was going on in the interior of the courtyard. This is the courtyard, and there's a small gathering space in that landscape, which is open through this gate to the land and to the MAC. And then in section, the birds and the shed roof and the wires and the new building attached to the old, which overhangs front, and then from the courtyard end, the existing buildings and the submerged landscape, the walk, the theater. And just in case you missed any of that, the construction manual is available on request. Thank you very much.